I better turn off my phone. Let's start. Malolele and talofalava, everyone. I think it's a little bit after quarter to two, so I think we should make a start. Welcome to the third session. This session is about Pacific and the diaspora and the well-being of Pacific peoples. My name is Jima Nawena Manuahu. I will be the chair for this session. I'm from the Department of Pacific Affairs from here at ANU. Welcome to everyone online and also for those of you here in person. Our first presenter is Laura Simpson-Reeves, who is a PhD candidate. The title of her presentation is Fiscal and Non-Fiscal Ideas of Responsibility amongst Samoan Diaspora in Greater Brisbane. She's a research assistant as well as a sessional academic at the University of Queensland. Her PhD examines cultural perceptions of poverty by exploring ideas of the good life amongst both Samoan and Tongan populations in Brisbane. So without further ado, let's give applause to Laura Simpson.
Thank you. Hopefully all the technology will work. All right, so good afternoon. Hopefully everyone's a bit more awake after lunch or possibly more sleepy. I tend to be more sleepy. And I'd first like to just acknowledge the Ngunnawal people that are the traditional custodians of the land that we're on here in Canberra, and also the Yagara and Turrbal people who are the traditional custodians in Brisbane, where I'm from. So, as Gemma said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, both with the Institute for Social Science Research and the Life Course Centre. And so today I want to talk about some of my PhD research, which is a longitudinal qualitative study. And I'm particularly talking about the Samoan diaspora living in Greater Brisbane. So this particular paper looks at responsibility and how the participants view that in relation to their family, their community, and themselves. Mostly is how they described it themselves rather than an interpretation. So based on the 2016 Australian National Census, so I'm quite excited to see what comes out of the census later this year. Those claiming Samoan ancestry account for approximately 1% of the Greater Brisbane population. Now, as you can see, what counts as Greater Brisbane is actually quite large, but the majority of Samoan population within Greater Brisbane live in that central area in the circle, particularly in Ipswich to Brisbane's west, which accounts for about 2.49%, and in Logan and Beaudesert to Brisbane's south, of which about 2.17% identify as Samoan. Perhaps more pertinent as well is that these figures are rapidly increasing, with a 30% increase since 2011 and a 100% increase since 2006. And I expect these to increase even more dramatically following this year's census. Despite this, there's actually been quite limited research in Greater Brisbane that examines the cultural perspectives of this group, with the exception of health and education. And in particular, there's very little that looks at responsibility, both fiscal and non-fiscal. Williams describes responsibility in terms of both prospective duties, so duties that are yet to be fulfilled or that are expected, and retrospective duties, so duties that were not fulfilled. And much of the Pasifika literature focuses on these prospective responsibilities, or these expected responsibilities, and they refer to these often as obligations or whālawa-lawa, which I'll talk about a little bit throughout. Falello, who's actually going to be speaking 2 papers after me, argues that many of these obligations extend across transnational spaces, referring especially to financial obligations, which may extend to family members, both in Australia, in New Zealand, or in the islands, and may influence the migration decisions of diaspora. For example, taking a better job in Brisbane because it pays more over a more prestigious but less well-paid job in Auckland. Some scholars at Griffith University, Stanley and Kearney, describe these tensions that these obligations can cause, particularly amongst Samoan youth, who often feel that they conflict with personal desires, for example, higher education attainment. As I mentioned, these obligations are often referred to as wha lava lava, which encompasses primarily monetary gifts, according to most of my participants, but actually is much broader and discusses the performance of social responsibilities around major life events, such as births, weddings, and funerals. So the findings that I'm presenting today are based on my fieldwork, which occurred between December 2018 and February 2021. So as I'm sure you can imagine, a large chunk of it was heavily influenced by COVID, and so has resulted in a number of repeat interviews, mostly via Zoom, with 16 participants. Some participants were interviewed once, others up to 5 times, with the majority interviewed between 2 and 3. So, in talking about responsibility, I will today discuss the way that the participants described responsibility in terms of their household, in terms of their community, and in terms of their future self. So, the literature, and here I'm referring to a lot of academic literature, uses the terms family and household quite interchangeably, as it's often assumed that these are the same thing. However, we know, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, that these terms can have different meanings based on the cultural composition and the norms of different cultural groups. Importantly, particularly in this case, is that members of the same household might not be immediate family members. There's often extended family members in there, or there may be material bonds between family members that are not resident in the same household. And so it may be perhaps not surprising at all then that there's no standard household composition for the participants in my study. They mostly consisted though of large extended family groups. So parents, children, often adult children, sometimes adult siblings of the parents and grandparents or aunts and uncles. And these were often quite transient as well. Where this was not the case, for example, a participant who was living with a flatmate that was not of the same family or ethnicity, this was repeatedly reinforced to me that this was an unusual situation and not normal for a Samoan woman. And so importantly, because the household makeup varies from time to time, it's often being described as transient or what Michaela Shire calls a multi-local family. So these families span across both national and regional borders, or there may be physical short distances between households. And this kind of circular spatial mobility of family members providing both financial and non-financial support, despite scattered living arrangements, was considered a very important part of doing family. And even though it wasn't part of the original focus of my PhD, family was something that consistently came up and was the focus for my participants. In relation to that, they often described personal sacrifice, particularly younger participants described personal sacrifice for familial gain. And this was typically in relation to financially contributing to the household. So one participant, for example, described taking a gap year between high school and university in order to help earn some extra money for her family. Not as many young Australians, myself included, who may have taken a gap year to earn money to go backpacking around Europe. And this was despite her family encouraging her to go to university. She chose to take the year off and earn money because she felt that was what was best for her family. Even once she continued with higher education, and this was quite common amongst many of my participants, they still had additional work, sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time work, or take breaks from their study in order to provide some extra income for the family. A lot of my participants did or were engaged in higher education, partly due to the recruitment strategies that ended up being results of COVID. But many of them described their friends who were often told to find work rather than pursuing higher education because it was more important to have money now rather than in the future. And the investment to 3 to 4 years was not necessarily seen as something that would be long-term beneficial for the family. And this is despite education particularly higher education, still being actively promoted in the literature and in policy as a pathway out of poverty. Nonetheless, the realities of day-to-day financial pressures mean that Samoan youth were often pushed into low-skilled employment that had more immediate gains, particularly factory work or security work. And this was in order to immediately contribute income to the household. The narrative consistently told to me by the younger participants, and by that I mean particularly participants under the age of 25, was that the funds that they earned through their other work, through casual, part-time or full-time work, or for those lucky enough to be eligible from welfare benefits such as youth allowance, was used to help pay for household expenses, particularly rent, bills and groceries. Few participants indicated that they were working extra hours in order to earn income for extracurricular activities. And those that did so were very quick to express that they were lucky, in their words, and that it was not usual, especially when they compared their situation to those of extended family members. Older participants, so participants who might have had children of their own, indicated that their income was used to support their household, the people living there, which might include not only their children, but also their parents or adult siblings, as well as family members that were residing outside of the household. Some of the younger participants felt that they were responsible to financially provide for their household, as they felt their parents were unable to do so, either due to the skill level, because many of their parents were involved in low skilled, or what I quite now like the term vocationally skilled work, or their parents needed to frequently travel back to Samoa, which had impacts on the type of work that they were able to do. Most participants indicated that their choices about employment versus higher education were directly related to providing financial support to their families. Even the types of higher education that they pursued was tied to employment opportunities and the ability to receive funding and provide an income for their family in the future. Yet these choices were very closely linked to cultural expectations, particularly, as I mentioned, around providing support for parents and kin. And while these may have been what some call tacit agreements, they were not necessarily always happy agreements. So other scholars, such as Nishikani, who has explored the Tongan diaspora in Melbourne, has argued that providing financial supports to family members is often viewed as an expression of love, and it's not as quite straightforward as just financial. However, while most of the discussion did focus on financial contributions to the household, participants did frequently discuss non-financial responsibilities. And for many participants, this included caring for younger siblings. So younger siblings were often brought up in interviews, and participants indicated that they had a strong sense of responsibility towards them, including making sure that their younger siblings attended school, did well at school, graduated. Even if they themselves had not gone to higher education, they wanted their younger siblings to do so. There was also a lot of discussion about responsibility towards older family members of the household, particularly amongst female residents, female participants. So older relatives, as I mentioned, including grandparents, aunts and uncles, typically lived in the household rather than live on their own. And the idea of such relatives living in a care facility was something that was not considered acceptable within the culture. It was therefore evident that a lot of individual choices were both constrained and also enhanced by cultural and familial expectations around responsibility and duty. So while responsibility to the household was often intertwined with responsibility to family members, participants also described responsibility to extended family and the broader Samoan community. Samoan cultures, as a lot of Pacific cultures, place high value on family. And again, family here is not just immediate family members, it refers to a lot of extended family members. But also a lot of participants discussed family in terms of their church community, and the intertwining between church and immediate family was quite complex. They had a strong sense of responsibility towards both family and their churches, and this was often referred to as Fa Lava Lava. And this extended, as I said, beyond both the family and even the church, but into the broader Samoan community. Particularly back to the islands or to New Zealand, because many of the participants have extended family in New Zealand as well.
And so whālawa roughly translates as obligation, but it's much more complicated. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around a lot of it, because every time I think I have it, one of my participants will say, no, that's not quite right. And I have to try again. So I apologize in advance if I'm not quite describing this perfectly. Obviously, I'm not from the islands. I probably should have started with that. I'm clearly Puangi, but so I'm still learning a lot of this. So whālawa refers to the cultural rituals and gift giving associated with life course events, as I mentioned earlier. And while historically these gifts were often things like food and mats, more recently, particularly in diasporic communities in Australia and New Zealand, this is translated into cash. And so giving of cash rather than food has been described in different ways by participants. Some find it easier and more applicable to Australian society, but the majority, particularly younger participants, spoke of it with exasperation, that they were always having to find new pockets of money for somebody somewhere. And this is particularly prevalent in the Brisbane area because the Samoan population is highly overrepresented in the lower socioeconomic areas of Brisbane. And so the idea of whālawa was quite, I guess, a source of tension for most of the participants. It was seen as something that was central to Samoan culture, something that was both uplifting and something to be celebrated, but also something that was frustrating and something that was often seen more as an obligation or something that was a requirement rather than necessarily something they wanted to do, which was at odds with a more individualistic culture that they had grown up with in Australia. The emphasis from the participants was always on the interconnectedness and interdependentness of community members, that you give, but also that people will give to you when you need. But the collective nature of this process, as I said, was often at odds with the more individualistic nature of broader Australian society. And so some participants described deliberate processes that they engaged in to separate themselves from the community in order to avoid cultural obligations and achieve themselves what they saw as a better life. So this tension between meeting their individual needs and meeting community needs was particularly apparent around the financial obligation elements of whālawa. And the best approach differed quite significantly between participants. Those that were perhaps second or third generation in Australia and had grown up here were more in favour of creating a savings account where money was regularly put aside so that the money was there when needed. However, others described parents or other family members going into huge amounts of financial personal debt, particularly through the use of payday loans that can have up to 46% interest rates. And this had an impact on other members of the household who then were called upon to help repay this loan. In addition, and I won't talk about it too much, but there's also remittances that go back to the islands. And so this was possibly not quite as regular as some of the earlier conversations that we heard this morning, but it was particularly around certain obligations or things that were needed. So perhaps renovating grandma's house or sending food for someone, paying school fees, etc. And this is something that's obviously quite common amongst Pasifika's population. And so finally, in addition to the responsibility to the household and the community, they also described a responsibility to their future self. So this was often described both implicitly and explicitly, that they had a responsibility to a better life because of what their parents had sacrificed in order to come here. The desire to do better was more often than not linked to the ability to provide for their family and community. And this was almost always linked to earning more income and increasing their own knowledge around, for example, financial literacy in order to help their family. And in particular, the form of earning a higher income or a better life was seen through non-blue collar jobs. So the life trajectories of parents and other family members had a direct influence on the choices that the participants made about education and employment. And so low skilled or vocationally skilled employment, particularly factory work, was seen as a failure and that you hadn't achieved the better life that your parents had set for you. And I won't go into it too much because I'm still learning the legalities of it, but obviously citizenship, for those that know much about it, was something that was also raised in terms of trying to get a better life.
So many of my participants, almost all, were New Zealand citizens, and that has implications for the kinds of things that they can access and benefit from within Australia. And so where they had siblings who might have been Australian, for reasons that I'm still not entirely clear, they often said that these siblings had a responsibility to do even better because they had these opportunities as Australian citizens that they themselves did not have as New Zealand citizens. So from those brief examples, responsibility plays out amongst Samoan diaspora through households, communities, and themselves. The tension between the individual and the collective is very evident in how these responsibilities are described. And while there are a lot of benefits that participants would talk about in terms of being part of the collective, and these were considered very central to their lives through support and a sense of belonging and identity, they often described that this belonging came at a cost, both financial and cultural, and many second and third generation participants struggled to justify. So these responsibilities are discussed as a key part of culture and something to be valued, but also something that creates a great source of tension. And so we need to further discuss notions of reciprocity and how this might play out. So in conclusion, it's incredibly complicated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that very informative presentation on your PhD research. It's good to know that you've just recently finished your data collection in Feb this year, so congratulations. So now I'll open up the floor for questions. I've got one. I think I'll start off with a question that's been put up on Zoom. The question is from Benjamin Dugest. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. Sorry, Benjamin. Does the lower view of tertiary education by family potentially reflect the lower returns for minorities in achieving the tertiary salary premium? And then he goes on to say that Gibson and McKinsey found that successful Tongan Pacific Access category visa holders in New Zealand outturned those unsuccessful by minus 270%. This persisted 10 years later, but barely grew despite the significant investments in education by those successful in New Zealand. Do you have a response, or does anyone in the audience have this?
I'm not entirely familiar with the system in New Zealand, so I'm not sure that I can comment much more on that. But I guess from what a lot of the participants were describing, it was a constant tension between needing money now and investing in the future. And there was particular discussion around what kinds of things you would study at university. So just to describe a lot of conflict with parents over studying things like communications or something that didn't, or like creative writing, like my first degree, or drama, as we heard earlier. Or sociology, which I'm currently in, because they weren't going to lead directly to a job. So there was a lot of pressure to study things like teaching, for example, to lead directly if you were going to go to university.
Thanks, Laura. Any other questions? Yes.
Thanks, Liz. I have two questions. One is that is what young people they've had free negotiating on the question. Do you have a sense that they are struggles collectively, as in amongst friendship groups or young people groups within them? Or is it about things? Young people, family. I'll put the second question up front. I'm curious to hear how your research design and methodology has adapted over this period of collecting data and scenario more about
So thank you. I would say the impression I got was that it was both individual and family and collective. Students that were currently or previously been to university spoke a lot about decision associations, which are relatively recent in Queensland universities. I have with the other states, so I know that some of them are in sort of 6 or 7 years old. I feel like it's one of the oldest users. And they often spoke about wanting to be part of these specific associations because they could find other people who were going through similar struggles. And that they did sometimes feel a bit disconnected from say extended family who to go straight into work or were forced to go straight into work due to financial family situations. And so I did get the data is a little bit, I won't say skewed because I'm a qualitative researcher, but it is biased in the sense of and I'll talk about this a bit when I talk about the method, but in terms of the type of questions that I related to. But it is a mix of, it did seem to be something that a lot of younger Samoan diaspora was struggling with. And then a lot of the more older, say in their, shouldn't say older, it's my age, like 30s and 40s, particularly if they'd had children of their own, often spoke about wanting to reconnect. So they spoke that they had deliberately distanced themselves from the culture as a young person. And then now that they had family of their own, or they had nieces and nephews of their own, they wanted to reconnect. So there did seem to be a kind of overall like flow between the two. In terms of my data collection, it was quite a interesting journey. So I started collecting data in December 2018, which is when I finally got my ethics approval. And the idea was around, it was more of a deep ethnography. It was designed around participant observation, spending time with people in their homes and their lives. And then I had a child that was born earlier than expected. And I took about a year off from fieldwork. And I came back in March 2020 and did 2 interviews, and then we all got stuck at home. And so I had to rapidly shift as ethnography was something that was no longer viable. So the majority of the interviews were done via Zoom, and I found that keeping an unstructured approach, talking to participants about what was interesting to them and doing it via Zoom really helped create, I won't say it's exactly the same as when you're doing ethnography, but it was as close as I could get given the circumstances of what I was engaging with. So it did sort of shift over time, but that did have implications as well for the types of information, because people didn't necessarily want to say negative things about family members when they were Zooming from the house that they were locked in with their family members.
Thank you so much, Laura. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for any more questions. I myself have lots of questions, but I'll perhaps talk to you one-on-one later on during the break. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Rose Namuri Sinclair. Dr. Rose is from Tabeteua Island in Kiribati. I apologize for my mispronunciation. Her PhD research with the Pacific Studies program within Va'ao Manu Pasifika at Victoria University of Wellington focused on the health and wellbeing issues of Pacific women. Rose recently used the Dalanoa methodology, weaved with a Te Maroro cultural approach to undertake qualitative research into the mental health impacts of climate change and immigration policy on Kiribati migrants in New Zealand. Let's give a round of applause for Dr. Rose.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Nangawo people, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Brigitte, Dr. April Henderson, and the late Dr. Jenny Neal, and also my examiners, Dr. Alitasi Tavila, who are from Victoria University, Dr. Maria Barocco from Massey University in New Zealand, Dr. Deborah Petra Outia, she's from the university in Finland. amazing where these people come from. And I also want to acknowledge my earlier supervisors at the initial phase of my thesis, the late Dr. Teresa Tewa and Dr. Sailo Swali, who moved from Victoria University to Auckland University. I also want to acknowledge the High Commissioners from the different Pacific Islands, my Pacific brothers and sisters, and all of you today, and also my family members and colleagues who may be joining online today. So it is my pleasure to have been given the opportunity to attend this workshop and share with you the key contributions of my PhD thesis, especially the richness of my women's stories that would add value to academia and policy making. So here, as you can see, my research is focused on the experiences of Kiribati migrants living in New Zealand who migrated to New Zealand under the Pacific Access category. So my research problem was framed around the experiences of most successful migrants who came on a visitor visa or short-term work visa and experienced difficulty in settling in New Zealand, particularly in accessing healthcare services. The current conditions of the PAC policy have created a lot of problems, stress, anxiety, which impact on the health and well-being of these women. And that's the primary interest of my thesis. So the Pacific Access category opened a new channel in 2002 for eligible Pacific people from Fiji, Kiribati, Tonga, and Tuvalu to migrate and settle permanently in New Zealand. So the aims of my research were to assess the health and well-being experiences of PAC migrant women using Kiribati migrants, Kiribati people as a case study. But the main question that I wanted to explore during my research was to understand whose responsibility is it to ensure the healthcare and well-being of these people. And secondly, to explore personal and policy-related aspects of healthcare and well-being that affect these women and how access to culturally appropriate healthcare and social services for these people could be facilitated. So my methodology, first it's important that I explain how I'm connected to undertake the research. As Pacific researchers have argued, research for Pacific people by Pacific people removes cultural barriers, language barriers, and uses indigenous Pacific knowledge of the Pacific. So research that does not incorporate Pacific voices, thoughts, and philosophy would disadvantage our Pacific people. So in conducting my research, I was also cautious and mindful of the confidentiality of my participants. So my apology, I won't show any pictures of my participants. But most of my participants, they prefer to use English names as opposed to Kiribati names because Kiribati names, as we all know in the Pacific, have connections with families and they could be easily identified. So while it's important to include the Pacific philosophy in the research, it's also important not to exclude the Western theories. Using a feminist lens, and I'm not trying to be promoting feminism in the Pacific, but I like the principle which is based on equity and elimination of inequality to empower women and improve their well-being. So in my research, this helps me to question and challenge the pair conditions that contribute to the disadvantage of the Pacific migrants. In the Kiribati culture, women play a very key role for the healthcare of the family. So I was particularly inspired to use the feminist oral history approach, which provides a voice for women, and my participants is a good target. I needed to have their voices heard and included in the research to inform better policies. Storytelling is another powerful story, another powerful tool in my research, because it helps me to interpret their stories in the world they're in. And they had a choice to provide me with their stories of how they first left Kiribati, arrived in New Zealand, and settled in New Zealand. And that gives me the full story to give me a better ideas of the problems that they went through. Government mentality is my favorite. It helps me to analyze how the two forms of economic and political systems, which are the Maniape, and I'll talk a little bit about that, the Maniape government mentality and neoliberal government mentality, and how it impacts on the health and well-being of Kiribati women who migrate and settle in New Zealand under the Pacific Access category. So this theory, first coined by Michel Foucault, a French thinker, used the word governments, which refers to a group of people with authority to govern a country, a state, a family, or community, or church. So this type of government provides a source of knowledge and power that shapes our view of the world, our lives, and our decisions. The other type of power is acquired from society that makes a person, their behavior, view of the world, how it shapes lives and actions. It is a theoretical framework used to critique neoliberalism, which critiques that it disarticulates state responsibility from welfare concerns and rearticulated it as the primary concern of the citizens and community. So in other words, it's neoliberalism removes state responsibility and allows community people, or in my case, migrants, to be responsible for their own problems. So the government mentality as a theoretical framework to critique neoliberalism is of interest in my thesis, particularly while assessing how the PAC impacted on the Kiribati migrants women in coping with the New Zealand's contrasting environment compared to the social, economic, and political cultures of Kiribati. So it's a useful tool to help me to understand the health and well-being experience of the PAC migrants. I also employ articulation theory to try and understand the complex experiences and issues that these women have gone through. So the contributions of my thesis to academia and policy making. So as I mentioned, Foucault's mentality conceptual framework was applied. So I use it to apply equally to understand both the changes from pre-colonial European contact to modern societies in New Zealand and in Kiribati. And it shows that in New Zealand, there has been a shift from welfareism to neoliberalism, which largely shows why the PAC system has a strong impact on the Pacific migrants. So it shows that the expectation of the PAC migrants to be self-responsible, and my previous presenter has talked a lot on responsibility. So the PAC policy has a strong neoliberal flavor and is clearly disadvantaging these PAC migrants from lower socio-economic status and those who have limited support networks in New Zealand. And I'll be talking shortly about some experiences of these women. So we can see clearly the drawbacks of these two political and economic systems that neoliberal governmentality is really focusing on self-responsibility with minimum state support. It lacks cultural competency and creates a lot of inequality and poverty among the people in New Zealand, especially the PAC migrants. So examples like that come out strongly from my participants, they struggle with the accommodation, they crowded in some friends' houses, they don't have the transports, they lack they don't understand the environment, where to go here and there. So it involves a lot of problems. With the money mentality, even though we have our culture is so rich and we cannot ignore this, but it has created a lot of barriers to most of these migrants, especially around respect, which people can see that people are shy or silent. It doesn't mean that they don't know anything, but it's just that part of their culture. And that creates a lot of problems to them in trying to settle well quickly in New Zealand, and also to kind of transfer responsibility to existing families because they have to bridge the social and health gap and help these people to settle well in New Zealand. So I will talk about, share the stories of 2 of my participants. Out of the 30 participants, these women have experienced the most, a big problem during their life. So Anne, aged between 31 and 35, married, has 2 adopted children, and came to New Zealand in 2009, experienced stillbirth. Anne's tragedy resulted not only from the poor health care provided by her midwife, as Anne's families have claimed, but from many other factors. First, Anne experienced issues of not accessing healthcare services because of her non-residence status, as she was on a short-term work visa. She did not have a good language translator with adequate health literacy to ensure that Anne understood her midwife and her midwife understood Anne's needs. The nature of her work could also have been a contributing factor as she worked right through until the end of her 2nd trimester. Financial constraint is another big problem, had forced Anne to work right through even though she was very pregnant. There was a missing link between the PAC officials and health officials to ensure that successful PAC migrants have language support when they see a GP or any health professional. Another story, Riri, aged between 35 and 40, selected in the PAC pilot in 2009 and came to New Zealand in the same year. Riri is a very strong woman to challenge Immigration New Zealand's initial decision to decline her application for residency under the PAC. Initially, Riri was mostly disadvantaged by her being unaware of the new environment, lack of practice in speaking English, being shy, that's part of her culture. And that prevented her from seeking help. And therefore, she also remained silent despite the problems that she went through. She also suffered from a lack of understanding of immigration systems and processes and lack of support networks with the Kiribati people in New Zealand. So while most of my participants have families and friends to support them, Riri was the unfortunate one that she stayed with a family who also has no idea about the process or have connections with employers to help her get a job offer in order to qualify for permanent residency. So unfortunately, so she remained undocumented for 7 years to regain her status. So she wouldn't have gone through this hardship if she received sufficient information about the PAC and how to settle in New Zealand. This is another important knowledge that is contributed by my thesis, especially what you can, it has been mentioned earlier that cultural competency is very key. And in order for policies to make effective results, we need to really understand the culture. So in my thesis, I try to explain the aspect of the system that support well-being. And so the Manebe is a central place where people get together, and the delivery of activities that that the families within the Manebe have to deliver kind of help them to gain the knowledge and skills in order to pass it on to other families. It's also a place where people learn to respect each other, and also within the Manebe system, the Unumani or the elders in the Manebe play a role to maintain peace within the village. So all these kind of cultural values that are being taught and passed on through the Manebe system are also applied within the family, the church, the community, and that's why I explained earlier that it kind of shapes our view of the world, influence our thinking and ways and actions. So one can understand that when these people come to New Zealand, they have a very different view of the world and how they address things differently in New Zealand. So in order to make what I'm proposing in my thesis is I'm proposing the Neo Manebe health and well-being model in the New Zealand society, and that will help us to kind of position the Manebe system within the New Zealand society. And with this model, in order to make with this model, I'm proposing that the policy needs to have cultural competency framework or kind of systems and processes in place to make new migrants to have a sense of belonging, understand their rights as new migrants, and also understand the gender role, and also having better access to healthcare services in order to avoid the pain that most of these participants or migrants have experienced. Extension of my research. So recently I have been part of a research team in Otago University that looks at climate change, immigration policy, and social impacts on mental health and well-being amongst Ikwiribes migrants to New Zealand. So this is a very good research that extends the findings of my research. And secondly, Pacific economy research that looks at what the Kiribati people in New Zealand have contributed in terms of their unpaid work and how they contribute to the economy. So it's interesting because one of my participants who was also participating in my research explained how she struggled to settle in New Zealand. But when I conducted this research, it shows that how much she had burdened to the economy of New Zealand. Sorry, I will end here and I'm happy to take any questions. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for such an important study and for sharing with us your insights and the findings from your PhD research. Now, I would like to now open up the floor to questions. There's currently no questions on Zoom. So if there's any questions from the audience. No, I'd like to ask a question if that's okay. Oh, okay.
Congratulations on a wonderful study, and double congratulations on getting Foucault into a policy conference. I'm very impressed. I was just wondering whether you've done much work or thinking around applying some of these insights to other, I guess, Pasifika migrants within New Zealand who fall outside the PAC context, if that makes sense? Or are there any other ways you can kind of broaden out the findings to think about well-being in, I guess, in other migration contexts?
Not really sure if I get the question right, but what after conducting my PhD research, I find that by engaging this, the new project that I mentioned earlier, it's very important that I put in the perspective of the Kiribati people in research and policy making. For example, when I mentioned about the Pacific economy research, it's important that I incorporate their perspectives in the research, because that research is going to be used by Government of New Zealand to inform their budget and resource allocation for the well-being of Pacific people, including Kiribati. So I'm quite happy that the Kiribati perspectives are being incorporated in those work.
Thank you, Rose. I have a question, if that's okay. I found your research really interesting, particularly in how you weaved the Te Maniawa approach with the Talanoa in terms of how data was being collected. I also liked your neo-Maniawa health model that you had developed from the findings of your research. And I found it quite interesting how on the top level of the sphere, there was the importance of ensuring cultural competency. And I think that's something that's really important, particularly by people not only working within the migration sector, but also by people who are working in the healthcare sector and the social care sector and services as well, particularly with the story that you had shared about Anne, who had sadly had a stillbirth while she was in New Zealand. And so had she had earlier access to primary care, despite having her visa expired, but had she had access regardless, we could have prevented the loss of a life. And so can I just ask, without identifying the confidentiality breach, was Anne living in Auckland? Yeah. So there's this primary care clinic called in Auckland in Otara, which is Isamki Healthcare, run by and there's a doctor there who's Tongan. And they actually provide services for migrants, regardless of whether they have the visa or not. And so that could be somewhere, for people who are on the PAC scheme, or, who have their visa or not, to access that clinic, to have healthcare. I think healthcare is such a vital and very important aspect of well-being, and it's unless we have certain initiatives or avenues where people can access the services, then we could, somewhat guarantee their safety and well-being whilst being away from their homeland. Was there any other questions or comments that people want to make in the audience before we move on to our next speaker? No? Well, we still have time, actually. We have 5 more minutes until our next presenter. Pardon? Do you want to move on? Sure. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Rose. Thank you so much, Rose. So without further ado, I'd like to present our next speaker, who is Dr. Lute Faleolo, and she will be presenting from Zoom online. So Dr. Lute Faleolo is a postdoctoral researcher at La Trobe University. Her recent PhD study considered the important links between well-being and migration, with a focus on Pasifika trans-Tasman migrants, specifically Samoan and Tongan, and their well-being within and in between New Zealand and Australia. The title of her presentation today is called Pasifika Trans-Tasman Migration, Mobility and Wellbeing. Welcome, Lute.
Hi. Hi, guys. I'm going to be sharing with you a screen. So nice to see you guys. I see some familiar faces here in the crowd too. Lovely to see you all. Okay. Hope this is up, Ari, as it's meant to. Looking okay? Cool. Okay, let's get started. Malolele, everyone. Warm Pacific greetings from Beenleigh in Brisbane. Whakawheta'i lahi ki he eiki I he taua usia, ha aho whakawhaofa pehen ke tau whesio whaki ai mo tala noa. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from which I'm speaking from today, the Yugambeh people of Beenleigh. Today I'm representing my family, Kainga, Pasifika from Australia and New Zealand, as well as our Pacific Research Cluster and the Archaeology and History teams with Professor Catherine Ellinghaus at La Trobe University in Melbourne. I acknowledge my advisory team, Professor Paul Mimott and Dr. Kelly Grenop at the ARC at University of Queensland, including Professor Mark Weston and Dr. Denise Clegg at the ICESA. Many thanks here to you, Gemma and Ari, for hosting this panel, and the rest of the team at ANU for hosting us today and for the invitation to join this amazing panel. Thank you, Laura and Rose, Dr. Rose, for your significant research and presentations today. My positionality as a researcher plays a big part in shaping my research and how I am speaking with you today. What I did earlier just before now is what we call a tulo, or a gesture of respect to you all. It is important to know who we are and where we come from in order to understand the significance of why we're here. So let me start. I'm an Aotearoa, New Zealand-born Tongan, Australian-based now, Pacific researcher, and I'm the second daughter of Reverend Ahoia Ilayu and Reverend Losa Ilayu, who left their villages on Tongatapu Island, Tonga, in the early 1970s to seek better educational opportunities for their children in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Most of my siblings, although born and raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand, now live in Australia. My Samoan husband's parents had similarly moved from Samoa in the 60s, with their 4 children raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand. 2 of them have since moved to Australia and experienced life here in Australia, with one returning back to New Zealand. Further to this, as second generation Pacific Island parents, my husband and I have made the big decision to raise our children in Australia, with one recently moving back to New Zealand for studies. We moved to Brisbane in 2015 to pursue higher education opportunities for ourselves and our children. And since then, we've seen great improvement in our lifestyle compared to what we were living with in Aotearoa. No disrespect to my country. Our familial collective settlement is forever progressive and adapting to circumstances and seasonal prospects. Employment contracts beginning or ending, COVID-19 travel bans or lockdowns and travel bubbles opening, closing, as you know, family milestone celebrations and health status changes. These are all happenings that we respond to collectively and in support of one another. Therefore, members of our collective often travel through Australia or Aotearoa and in between these 2 countries, or even back to our Pacific homelands, temporarily or long-term, to help out until the needs of another member is met. These migration narratives are not unique to me or my family. They are a common trans-Tasman migration experience among many Pacifica collectives that are residing across the region. It is through these different mobility and migration lenses that I hear, appreciate, and understand the stories of my ancestors, of my research informants, and it is through these lenses that I continue to illuminate our contemporary movements within my research spaces. Okay. The research findings presented in this paper are drawn from research conducted with Samoan and Tongan groups in Australia and New Zealand since 2015 as part of my PhD work that focused on their trans-Tasman migration wellbeing experiences, and it continues today as my postdoctoral inquiry through the ARC project with Dr. Catherine Ellinghouse and her team, looking at Pacific people's mobility to and through Australia and the intersections of these with Indigenous mobilities. Pasifika perspectives and their narratives are at the heart of the work that I carry out, and so I would like to present these significant understandings today. The three focal areas for my presentation today speak about the perspectives and experiences of Pasifika trans-Tasman migrants, namely our movements to Australia through Aotearoa, New Zealand, our collective mobility, and our shared wellbeing. The five key ideas I will focus on today are holistic understandings of Pasifika in relation to what constitutes meaningful progress and betterment for us. The trans-Tasman migration of people from their Pacific homelands through to New Zealand and to Australia is an important process of collective mobility. Migration and employment within diaspora is only part of a series of interlinked processes that promote collective wellbeing and holistic progress, which I term whakalakalaka, whakalukufua, which is a Tongan term. I note that there have been several misconceptions about Pasifika activities involving their progress, agency, mobility, and remittance. So I would like to start by defining Pasifika notions of holistic wellbeing, holistic development, or whakalakalaka, whakalukufua, collective agency and mobility, and reciprocity. As I go through this list, you will note that there are overlapping of concepts and how the meaningfulness of our movements across time and space are interwoven and quite holistic to us as a mobile people. The concept of Pasifika collective agency refers to the shared efforts of Pasifika familial members working either in conjunction with or without external groups including church organizations and government agencies, to assist, support, and nurture the collective's progress. Familial collectives are families that are connected through blood and marriage, as well as other strong affiliations such as village and church. These familial collectives span several locations. Although this paper focuses its discussion on the trans-Tasman migration flows and links, it is important to keep in mind that most familial collectives, if not all, will include links to members in America, Asia, Europe, and the Pacific homelands, not just Australia and New Zealand. It is noted here that such expansive global familial networks are not unique to Pacific peoples. However, these Pasifika familial collectives that I'm speaking about today are quite unique in how they are nurtured and how they utilize the collective in their shared mobility within and in between Australia and New Zealand. Whakalakalaka whakalukufua, although it's an expansive topic of discussion on its own, can be summed up as the holistic progress of all areas of life. More specifically, it is the holistic progress of 8 wellbeing spheres, which I had identified through my research. These 8 spheres are spiritual God, which includes a connection to God, having spiritual belief systems that is relied upon for stability and personal growth. Familial social is the second one, which includes immediate family as well as extended, and it can include close members of a community, church family. Third one being economic provision, which includes helping others, providing for others. Fourth one, cultural, which includes cultural identity and cultural association. Fifth one, mental, emotional. Sixth one, economic sustainability. And seventh, physical. And lastly, environmental, which is the 8th one. Now, Pasifika usually identify themselves with a familial collective that is also connected to other collectives. The progress of an individual is not seen as a progress of one, but of many. Almost always, whakalakalaka whakalukufua of any Pasifika individual includes their significant others, their spouse, their partner, children, grandchildren, parents, siblings, grandparents, and it often extends to people outside of these groups, whether that is their fellow Pasifika within a given context, their village, the community, sports teams, etc. This brings us to the concept of reciprocity. Although it is often discussed by Pacific researchers as a giving back, it is not always properly understood in all its fullness by readers who do not share the understandings and the values beneath the giving or the gift. Reciprocity is not a simple repayment of something. In Pasifika familial collectives, there are roles and responsibilities that define the socio-cultural relationships of members and their gifting. So Western literature doesn't often capture this, and they often record these giftings as remittances, which suggests that it's a one-way monetary transaction. However, to properly understand what may seem to outsiders as just a monetary or economic exchange, we'll need to understand the social and cultural significances of reciprocity within the familial collective structures and how this contributes to whakalakalaka whakalukufua, and hope to unpack this soon if I have time. So Pasifika notions of a good life or well-being can be better understood when seen from a point of solidarity as a collective aspect of the Pasifika worldview that anchors Pasifika well-being behaviours, including their migration movements. What emerges in my study of Pasifika trans-Tasman migrants is that we define our well-being holistically, and several other Pasifika studies support these findings, namely Muffy and Pope, who present their findings of Tongan holistic well-being based on 2 separate studies of Tongan people living in New Zealand. And they've come across findings that are similar to the 8 spheres that I noted earlier. Pasifika notions of well-being are holistic. So there are those 8 spheres that I noted earlier. And these are not standalone, they actually are overlaid and interwoven, which makes it quite a complex understanding of well-being. Whakalakalaka whakalukufua. When Pasifika have negative well-being experiences as migrants and they come to expect that their well-being aims are not going to be fulfilled in a particular location, this negative well-being change perception gives impetus for further migration to occur. And these links between well-being experiences, well-being perceptions, and location fulfillment are better understood when we consider how Pasifika view migration as a progressive and holistic development that is influenced by their pursuit of well-being fulfillment for their collective. Pasifika concepts of progress and development relate to the anticipated well-being aims and hopes that Pasifika have for the future for their collectives. So whakalakalaka whakalufua is the holistic progress of all well-being spheres that I mentioned earlier for their familial members, and it includes holistic progress, not just for one, but for others. Pasifika usually identify themselves within the familial collective that is also connected to other collectives. So they're not standalone collectives either. They're all very interconnected with others. So the progress of an individual is not seen as the progress of one, but many. Almost always this includes the family, extended included. Pasifika collectives occur as circular, ongoing movements. Their migration, that is, Pasifika migration of collectives occurs as circular ongoing movements over time and across places. And the significance of the familiar connections that exist in these movements is that they provide the lifeline for individuals and family groups, both in the homeland and diaspora. And my study in Brisbane and Auckland picked up on the way the collectives had nurtured and maintained groups of people that were not able to access social welfare benefits, especially here in Australia. And that was mentioned by Laura in her presentation. The agency The agency of Pasifika as migrants does not easily fit into the development or migration theories presented in mainstream literature. There's one theory that can explain all of the processes involved in Pasifika. There is no one theory that can explain all of the processes involved in Pasifika trans-Tasman migration. There are several theories that illuminate aspects of the Pasifika people's movements, namely the mobility, transition, modernization, and dependency theories. Unfortunately, as King points out, these concepts on their own are not always holistic in their consideration of people, places, migration, and settlement. For instance, the circular movements of our Pasifika people between main urban centres in America and New Zealand, Australia, including back home, are not designed by the dependency of these people on the governments of Australia, New Zealand, and America. Rather, it is just an extension of sociocultural connections, as Lilo Maiava points out. So this brings me to the economic mobility. Anga whakatonga, better known as the Tongan way of life, or Whaasamoa in Samoan context, Samoan way of life. These are frameworks that our Pacific, Samoan, and Tongan groups, I found in my research, use to make decisions on what they're giving, how much they give, to whom they give. And it's again, those sociocultural spaces or the relationships within the frameworks of Anga Whakatonga and Whaasamoa that inspires their movements and their mobility, because their movements and their mobility is part of their gifting also. So Lilo Maiava highlights the existing links between cultural frameworks and mobility, explaining that the significance of this knowledge set is comprised of symbolic capital and non-material investments made by people migrating further abroad. Lilo Maiava argues that the symbolic capital is often more important than the economic capital, and that allows them to live within a Western system of development and individual gross product, domestic product, yet it is still purposeful and meaningful to them and their collectives, because it is driven by a moral economy. Which also links to the idea of reciprocity. So the concepts of tauhiwa for the Tongan people, or teoleva, tausileva for the Samoans, means to nurture social relations. This is something that Kaili and the Anai speak about. So the importance of these processes of tauhiwa or teoleva is that Pacific people and their relational socio-cultural spaces are maintained and nurtured. So reciprocity is focused on maintaining these spaces, these sociocultural spaces. The importance of reciprocity in Pasifika Protocol is that it is not only about receiving a gift, but the returning of the gift in exchange. And this is visually evident in celebrations like weddings, anniversaries, even funerals, as Pacific people view reciprocal relationships as a significant way of life. On the other hand, remittance, as you know, has been defined as a sum of money sent in payment or as a gift. But it's important to understand that our reciprocity, it does include funds, money. If my mum needed money for a funeral, I'll send it through. But it is not always a monetary type of gifting. It sometimes looks like a grandparent living in Australia for 3 months to watch the kids while mum goes to work. So remittance is written about by several researchers, noting it as a unidirectional flow of funds from diaspora back to homeland. But that's something that I guess I refute. I think I'm running out of time, so I think I might wrap it up. So to understand Pacific people's movements, we must consider Pacific people's perceptions about space and meaningful places like Australia and New Zealand. And the process of Pacific migration can be seen as an act of fulfilling hopes for their collectives. Whakalakalaka whakalupufor, the holistic progress of all wellbeing spheres for Pacific families and their collectives occurs in concurrence with their trans-Tasman movements as they thrive across multi-sited collectives. Thank you. Sorry, I can't hear. Okay, I can hear now.
Can you hear
Yeah.
me now?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Thank you. That was a terrific talk. I just feel I need to read your thesis and think about it for about a year, I suspect. There seems so much with it, that you were referring to. But I just wanted to specifically ask you about, you mentioned safety as one of the spheres of well-being. And because of my backgrounds in criminology, I guess, I know how family can be a place of risk. Those social relationships within family can cause intra and inter violence between and within family groupings. So I just wondered if you could elucidate more on what you found or think about safety.
So, sorry, could you just, I missed what you meant by the sphere. What sphere was that you mentioned?
Among your 8 spheres of well-being, I thought you mentioned safety as one of the spheres.
Oh, spirituality. But safety, yeah, that would come across under the familial social aspect of their well-being. I guess I could link that to the safety that comes through being a part of a collective. No, when you say there are questions around their security or their safety, did you mention domestic violence? I think it was. And domestic violence, again, that's a concept that's been defined from a Western frame. I think you've got to be careful that you don't take Western concepts and just slap it onto groups of people that don't really acknowledge that as violence. So I understand discipline is probably a word that they will use within our collectives. Violence is something that the police have slapped on discipline. I know that as a child growing up, the spoon didn't mean violent to me. It meant, oh, I've been naughty and mum and dad's helping me straighten up. But I understand also that there have been concerns raised in Tonga, for example, during lockdown situations where domestic violence has been discussed publicly after an article was released, and that happened within a particular family context. What happened is the villagers came across and helped sort this matter out. So being part of a collective, your family is not isolated. It's incidences that happen within the home. They don't stay covered for long because they become exposed through the collectives, and it becomes something that's discussed and sorted at different forums within the collectives. It could be at the church meeting, it could be within the extended group meeting. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, that our collectives have ways of dealing with what's been labeled violence or situations of domestic violence. There are ways that they are sorted within these collectives and help with safety. But I think often there's disagreements on what the second, third generation kids have called a smack or violence versus the understanding of the first generation migrants who have always grown up with that as a way of correcting behavior before it becomes criminal. Yeah. Now, I hope that helped answer your question.
Thank you.
Like, yeah.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you, Ruth, so much for your presentation. I also want to read your thesis and spend a year thinking about it. Yeah, and thank you for making that distinction between remittances and reciprocity. It made me think more broadly about those flows and that, they're more than just economic. And I'm just wondering, you must have mapped all these kinds of flows and you also mentioned that people are in Australia and don't have access to social welfare benefits. And I'm not sure what their income earning power is, but I'm just interested in how those flows of, you know, when there might be an expectation of an economic flow or a remittance in the terms of money, how that gets negotiated when that's not available. Yeah, did you sort of delve into that kind of stuff in your work?
Yeah, so I know that some of the women that I had spoken to had little groups that collected funds. They were a group of friends, and they said that that's just something they do regularly on a monthly basis. They'd get together in someone's lounge and they'd have a potluck dinner and they'd collect funds. And that was like a collection that didn't go into any of their own accounts. They went into a shared account. And then they withdrew from that when each person had a need throughout the years. So one woman said that she was preparing for her son's wedding, and she put forward an amount and they all withdrew it from that account. Another lady said that she wants to go back to Tonga to see her elderly parents. So they put money aside for her and her kids to fly to Tonga. So that was only one way that I'd seen people collectively using their funds and using that to help each other out within the Brisbane context. I know that happens in family groups back in New Zealand because they're a bit more well established as larger family networks, but here in Brisbane it was happening in non-familial type networks. That's one example. There's so many. I might be talking for an hour, but that's one. I hope that helps answer your question. So those things were happening that were observed. I know now with COVID happening, a lot of the times, because people usually visit their elderly, it's part of our care for elderly. We don't usually put them in homes. The thing is to have one of the children of a family network look after the elderly person, and the elderly person usually rotates. They'll usually travel. For example, out of a family of 8 that I'd looked at, the relatives in that group had sent the father and mother through their homes over a cycle of probably 8 trips, being the 8 households over 3 years. And that was part of their elderly care. That was done because they decided that was better than putting them in an aged care home. And in return, the grandparents were also babysitters. They'd watch the kids when they were staying at a particular home with young ones. So it doesn't always look like money. Yeah, it looks like time spent or helping out, which is why I said earlier that it was more just to help a need. That was the focus. Thank you.
If it's okay, I'd like to make a little comment and question. In the name of sustaining and maintaining our wanga whakatonga as Pacific peoples here in Australia who continually migrate from here to New Zealand and back, what are some ways do you think we could maintain, our cultural values such as tauhiwa and the importance of progressing towards the important concept of, whakalakalaka, whakalukufua?
Sorry, Gemma, could you just mention that again? I'm just finding it hard to hear from this end.
So she can be on here. Oh, here. So in the name of maintaining and sustaining our anga whakatonga or our Pacific values, such as that of, the importance of tauhiwa and reciprocity, and also towards our progress of practicing, different avenues towards whakalukufua. What are some ways that you think we could maintain that, particularly for, Tongan and Samoan people being born in Australia or being born in New Zealand?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so that's come up quite a bit too with the younger generation that I was speaking with, and even young Pacific researchers based here in Australia who are 2nd, 3rd generation. And we talked a lot about the maintenance part of what we've carried on from our parents leaving New Zealand especially. And a lot of them wanted to compare, what do you do, Ruth? You've got kids here. How are they coping with the new environment and new way of seeing things. And I was like, oh, we just carry on whakawhaamili being a time in the day, usually the evening, where we sit down with our children and we impress upon them cultural values. It's something that usually happens even at the dinner table. In the weekends, we get more time to do that because we attend church together or we go to places and visit together, and we speak about connections that we have with home. We recall stories that we've been told by our parents or our grandparents. And I think that's one way which is really important for us to maintain our anga whakatonga and our holistic collective progress, is by continuing the stories, the narratives, which is why I think it's even more important in my research to capture these and to record them accurately. So yeah, time and storytelling, time together with the young ones especially.
Is there any other last minute questions from the audience or comments that people want to make? Curtis, did you want to make a comment or something? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you. I think that's the negative impact of being the Tongan representative here. Hello, Ruth. And, thank you. I think it's this session. It's all the three presenters are based on the Pacific, but I think all of you, Ruth, and also Laura and Rose, I think you guys need to focus on the cultural aspect, and it's about education, not only to us but also to our Australian and New Zealanders, brothers and sisters, if we all have a better understanding on our culture, because I think, Lara, you put it rightly, it's complicated, but it's only complicated if you're not aware of our culture. Because for example, if there's a family with 6 kids, an Australian teacher or a New Zealand teacher would not understand why the eldest will always be late. Because the eldest is responsible to take all the siblings to class before she or he will be the last one to go to her class. So I think it is important for us to have better awareness and educate ourselves from both sides, the Australian and the New Zealand aspect, and us islanders, so we can be aware and respect to each other. So I think it's just a comment for 3 presenters. I think culture is the key for us to be able to share, and the complicated issue will not be there, because it's only complicated because sometimes Tongans, I can only speak for Tonga, that's why you find it complicated, Laura, because our diaspora will not say anything negative to put down our culture or our family or our relatives. So the only answer they will give you, it's complicated. But because it's the love and the care that they have for our culture, our people, and our family. So I personally think the key to have a better understanding is to understand our culture. And it's very common, very similar. We have a similar culture throughout the Pacific. It's a family, it's the center of everything. And like what Ruth mentioned, we usually come together and talk as family in the evening. It's not only once, almost usually for me, it was always an evening every day where we come together and pray. And I hear my father and my mother telling us what to do, what not to do. And definitely, like what Ruth said, the spoon. Unfortunately, mine was a wooden spoon, not the. But it was a way of disciplining and telling us how to be a good son of our family and our village. So to us, we don't see it as abuse, but it's disciplined. And so I think there's still a need for us to have a better understanding and awareness of culture. And thank you to Ruth and also Lara and Rose for the amazing presentation. I think just my comment and addition to for us to focus also on our cultural aspect. In that way, our brothers and sisters here in Australia and New Zealand will have a better understanding, so we can do away from the complicated issue. Thank you. Malo abito.
Malo apito Curtis, malo apito Dr. Lute Faleolo for your amazing presentation today, and I look forward to meeting you in person sometime in the future. Now we will close this session, and we will go on break for, I think we only have maybe half an hour. Okay, half an hour break, and then we'll come back for the last session for today. Thank you, guys.